Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to Hang Seng Management College. We are very sorry that we have to keep you inside in this conference hall in such beautiful weather today. But we have something very rewarding, very inspiring, very exciting, very interesting for you. This is the first public lecture by Professor John Minford at Hang Seng Management College, and today's topic is James Legge and the Chinese classics. Let's give a very warm welcome to Professor Minford.
Thank you very much, and welcome back to this series of talks. Today I'm going to talk about a very big topic, actually, and I've done a handout which you've all got, and I've also prepared a series of images on a PowerPoint, which I'll be showing you. And as I was explaining earlier on, often my style of teaching, which has definitely changed over the past few years, is that I have a logical plan, which I normally throw away when I walk in the door, and then I have some pictures which I use as a kind of tapestry around which to weave a series of more or less incoherent thoughts. I think as I reach the advanced age of 70, I think, as Confucius said, when you reach the age of 70, you can do what your heart tells you to do, and that's what I'm. I think he said, 从心所欲. You can follow what your heart desires. So I can use this as an excuse to more or less do whatever I like, and I have to crave your forgiveness if I'm not at all a kind of coherent lecturer. What I'm trying to do, two things. As those of you who came on Thursday realize, I do have a kind of message, which is that culture and translation are inextricably connected. Without translation, there could be no culture. Translation is what keeps the world in communication with itself, and it keeps different cultures in communication with themselves, and it enables cultures to grow and to make new beginnings. And one of the great exponents of that idea was a man called Ezra Pound, who is one of the great figures of 20th century Anglophone literature and one of my personal heroes. He was, of course, completely mad, but like so many mad people, he was absolutely brilliantly talented. Now, so that's, so we need translation for culture to remain alive, but we also need culture for translation to be possible. And that's really my main theme during this month, which is that any good translator is fed by an almost bottomless well of culture. You have to have an insatiable appetite for culture. And I'm not talking about culture in some sort of awful sense about highbrow listening to Beethoven string quartets all day, I mean, let's give ourselves a break. I mean, culture is everything. Culture is the color of your seats. The culture is the air we breathe. Culture is the food we eat, the wonderful wine that we drink, and so on. This is all culture. It's about life. It's about embracing life in its full richness. And that's why, as I said on Thursday, sometimes if students come to me and they want me to help them translate, for example, I mentioned Flaubert's novel, Madame Bovary. I don't know if you've read that, but it's quite a shocking novel about a woman in her middle age who decides to break all the rules of marriage and commit adultery. That's what they used to call it in the old days. And it's a very, very tragic novel. I reread it recently on a train journey, and it really made me very, very sad. That's because I'm now, an old guy, and I can look at these things and I sort of have some experience of life. But you see, if a young person comes to me and says, I'm translating Madame Bovary, Professor Minford, could you help me? Normally I would just say, well, go away and have a bit of life first, and discover what this all means, and then you could maybe consider translating this novel. I remember when I was a teenager at my school, we were all I was about 15 years old, and so inexperienced in life. I was at a single male-only school, boarding school. I'd never even met a girl properly, I mean, I might have shaken hands perhaps, but I mean, I knew nothing about life, and we were all made to read the novels of D.H. Lawrence It was absolutely absurd, you know. When I came to read Lady Chatterley's Lover, I just had no idea what it was all about, you know. And I believe that translators, in order to understand what they're translating, they need to have had a life, you know. Of course, some people are able to have a very rich life of the imagination. You don't necessarily have to go out there and fight a war in order to translate War and Peace. You can use your imagination, and the imagination is an extraordinary tool that we have, that we're blessed with. And your spiritual understanding is very closely linked to your imaginative power. Now, so in other words, I mean by culture, I mean all of this. You know, after all, in the scientific world, culture is the thing that you grow bacteria in, you know. It's an environment. It's a life-giving, rich environment. That's what we need as translators. And without it, we will fail. And so that's my kind of, if you like, my kind of message. And then I've chosen these 4 great figures from the British past to talk about, and not in an academic way. I'm no longer an academic. I can say that with pride, because I've actually retired from my university chair, so I'm what they call emeritus. And whenever I type the word emeritus, for some reason it comes out as demeritus, which means I don't deserve anything, right? And I prefer to be a demeritus professor, because I don't think academics really deserve a great deal. They get so well paid, and they spend their lives having so-called beautiful ideas, most of which are thoroughly sorry, I shouldn't be rude about academics, because I'm in the company of several distinguished academics. However, I'm very pleased no longer to be an active academic. I'm retired, so I can speak the truth. And I'm still proud to be a translator, because I think translators are seriously hard-working people with a profession that makes great demands on them. And the thing is, if you're a translator, you have to have readers, otherwise what you do is completely meaningless. And readers are the strictest judges. They will not buy your books if they're no good. Whereas academics can go on publishing forever, you know, provided some poor journal is willing to accept their publication, usually because they're a friend of the author or something. You know, I mean, I'm very pleased no longer to be an academic and to be able to speak purely and simply as a translator. And I've chosen these 4 inspiring people because I believe they are shining examples that we can hold in our minds that will keep us on the straight path as translators, because I've only really just begun, you know. I'm 70 years old, but I feel I've only really begun. And I still have a great deal to learn, and I'm really enjoying learning, and I enjoy translating. I enjoy the adventure of embarking upon new projects all the time. I'm working on 2 new projects this year, and I've got about 3 or 4 lined up for next year, because the French always say, you know, when you don't have projects, you no longer live. And that's also part of what I mean about culture, you know. It's the sense of exploration, of constantly knowing that there's something else outside the door that's worth going after, you know. And once I lose that feeling, I might as well go and live in Florida and just sort of sit on my backside and just, you know, drink cocktails all day. Anyway, let's get to the point. I'm talking today about James Legge. I've recently read, because of my invitation to come here and my choice of topic, I started to reread, or in some cases to read for the first time, things that have been written about James Legge. And there are 2 very large books that have appeared in the last 10 years, and there's one smaller book which has also appeared quite recently by a scholar who I don't know personally, but who wrote this as a PhD at the Baptist University. Some of you might know him. Anyway, I've listed these works at the end of my handout. I have to say that none of these books are doing what I want to do. I want to get to know the man, James Legge. I've known about him ever since I was 20 years old and when I first started to study Chinese. But he was always presented as a rather austere, rather unlikable missionary whose only aim in life was to preach the Christian gospel to the heathen Chinese. And he's had, I think, what you might call a bad press. I mean, people don't find it easy to say nice things about James Legge. And most of these serious studies come along with all the baggage of some ideology. You know, they're usually talking about Orientalism or post-colonialism or some other ism from cultural studies or whatever it is. And I find that so tiresome because, you see, I know that translators are real people and I want to know more about them so that I can find out what it is that makes them work the way they do. I've had the great honor and privilege in my life of studying for a long time as an apprentice under one of the truly great translators of our time, David Hawkes, and I shall talk about him in my last lecture because he was my teacher, my friend, my father-in-law, my collaborator, and when he died in 2009, I lost my closest friend. And I had the great privilege to work with him for some 25 years altogether, in fact more. And so I do know what makes a great translator tick, you know, because I knew him. And he was the greatest translator of his time from French, and from Chinese, sorry. He did actually also translate French. But, and I feel that for me that was such an inspiring experience to know, to be so close to a really great translator. I know how he worked. I know what enabled him to achieve the extraordinary results he achieved. I mean, in his lifetime, he translated two works, the Chu Ci and the Hong Lou Meng, two of the most difficult works in the whole of Chinese literature. But he rose to the challenge and he produced superb results. And I know how he did it because I was with him along for a very long period of time. Now, I want to try to do the same thing with three people I didn't know personally. And the first of them is James Legge. And I had a feeling, you see, that this man was probably a lot more interesting than the books were prepared to tell us. But unfortunately, he's been dead for 120 years. So I can't go and ask him or interview him or talk to him or sit at his feet. I just have to try to get through all these layers of academic obfuscation. You know, obfuscation is when you make something dark, which shouldn't be dark. But somehow at the back of my mind, I had this inkling, I had this suspicion that James Legge was really a very interesting man and a very exceptional man and a very great man. And so I've been digging around for the last month or so, trying to get through to the real James Legge. You know, it's a bit like Sherlock Holmes. I'm convinced there's a real person out there, but we've got to get through a lot of obstacles to find out who he is. And I've read a lot about him, and certain things really stuck in my mind. And I'm going to spoil my whole talk by telling you the three things that stuck in my mind, because they really are, for me, more important than pages and pages of translation theory or Orientalist discourse or post-colonial claptrap, you know. Three things. First of all, when he went to live in the Far East for the first time, he went to Malacca in what was then Malaya. And I found this is the thing that made me really stand up and say, yes, I know you're a real person. What did he do when he got to Malacca? He got himself a pet, right? Now, I have 3 dogs. I'm very interested in pets, right? And, you know, one of my closest friends has 2 cats. And I was talking to him this morning on Skype. And there he was in Australia with his 2 cats. And, you know, my 2 sisters, they had horses when they were young. And, you know, it tells you a great deal about somebody. What kind of pet they have. Now, I bet none of you know what kind of pet James Legge had. Does any of you know? He had a crocodile. Okay, he had a small crocodile, but not only did he have a crocodile, but apparently he used to wave it around above his head, right, like this. So I thought of trying to get hold of a crocodile in Hong Kong, not a real one, but a plastic one, and bringing it in and waving it around, because, you see, somebody who has a pet crocodile is clearly a very unusual person. I mean, very, very unusual. You know, my brother, who's a very serious academic economist, he had a pet parrot. Now, having a pet parrot is not that unusual. It's a little bit unusual for a serious economist, but, you know, having a crocodile is, I don't know of anyone else who had a pet crocodile. I've seen crocodiles in northern Australia, and they absolutely terrify me, you know. I would, you know, you know, they are very scary creatures, crocodiles, alligators, whatever you want to call them. So James Legge had a pet crocodile, okay, number one. Number two, when he left Hong Kong in 1873, James Legge took a trip up to the north. He went to Shanghai, he went to Beijing. And when he was in Beijing, he went to visit the Temple of Heaven, the Tiantan, right? And, you know, let's not forget, he was a Christian missionary. When he entered the Temple of Heaven, he was so overcome with awe, A-W-E. He said that himself. He said he was overcome with a sense of awe at the sacredness of the Tiantan, you know, that he took his shoes off and he knelt down. And this is James Legge, the terrifying Christian missionary. He was overcome with a sense of true awe about this Chinese temple in Beijing. So he was clearly not a blind, biased Christian missionary. You know, he was a man who had an open mind. In fact, the more I've read about James Legge, the more I realize he was a man who had a deep sympathy, a deep empathy for Chinese culture. Very much so. And that's going to be something I'm going to stress in the remains of my talk today. So that's two things. The third thing, actually I've got about 20 things, but I'm choosing 3. And I forgot what the third one was, but now I've remembered. Okay. The third one is his habit of work. Again, I don't think I know of another translator who does this. Tell me if you know one. You know, everybody who's every writer or translator has to have some kind of method of work. I don't mean, you know, a theory. I mean, do they work from 10 till 12 in the morning with a break for coffee? Or do they work late at night? Or what? You know, the great 19th century novelist Anthony Trollope, he used to work, you know, from 9 till 12, and he would write a certain number of words every day, and he just did it all his life, you know. And lots of those Victorian novelists would work for a very long period of time every day. Now, James Legge used to get up every day at 3 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock, when it was still dark, and he would work from 3, and then at about 8 or 9 his family would get up. But he had that period of 5 or 6 hours when it was absolutely quiet in the house. And he just worked. He just worked and worked and worked. So he was a very, very, very dedicated man, very single-minded, incredibly self-disciplined. But, you know, not in a sort of fanatical sense. He was also very human. James Legge was born in Scotland. Now, it's very easy when you give the facts about someone's life to say something like, you know, James Legge was born in Scotland in 1815. That's the end of the story, is it? No, it's not the end of the story, because Scotland's a very, very strange place. You know, I've been there. I'm not Scottish, but I mean, Scotland is another world. You know, it's another country. It's an incredibly beautiful, extraordinarily wild, extraordinarily pure and simple and natural country, you know, with the most extraordinary wilderness. And here's the countryside near the small town where James Legge was born, called Huntly. And so he was born in Scotland, and he went back to Scotland whenever he went home to the British Isles. He would go back to Scotland, not to London, but to Scotland. And that's where he hailed from. And some other very remarkable people came from Scotland. And he he went to school at a grammar school, which in those days was a good school to go to. I mean, it wasn't one of the top schools. But when he was at secondary school, he already showed that he had an extraordinary mind. He was very gifted at languages. He studied Latin and Greek. But he didn't just study Latin and Greek. He was absolutely brilliant. And he won the top scholarship to go to Aberdeen University, which is one of the oldest universities in the United Kingdom. A very fine university. The Scottish have a wonderful education system. It's probably superior to England. And he entered King's College in Aberdeen University, which is one of the oldest colleges in any British university. I think it goes back to the 15th century. And he studied there, and this is the chapel. He studied classics, he studied Latin and Greek, and he was so brilliant. He came out the top student. He was awarded the top prize called the Huttonian Prize. And his professor, the professor of Latin, said to James Legge in his last year, "I want you to stay on to become my assistant and then to take over from me when I retire." So in other words, at the age of 20, James Legge had a future career as a very high-flying academic, as a professor of Latin. And he was well known for his ability to remember huge amounts of text by heart, just by looking at them. You know, some people have this extraordinary ability to memorize things just by looking at them once. And James Legge was like that. So he was a phenomenon. I mean, he really was a high-class mind. And but he decided immediately that he didn't want to become an academic. He didn't want to become a translator either. He wanted to be a missionary. And he went to London, he went to the Highbury Theological Seminary to train as a missionary. And it soon became clear to him and to the people training him that he was destined to go and be a missionary in the Far East, as they called it then, i.e. in China. Now, he did his training in London and he started to study Chinese at the British Museum. He had a personal tutor. And then he set out for the Far East. Now in those days, this was in the late 1930s, and it would have been very hard for him to go to China, as it had been for his predecessor, the great Robert Morrison. And this is a picture of Robert Morrison with two of his Chinese assistants. And Robert Morrison, who was also a missionary and was from the very north of Britain, he was obliged to live to move between Macau, Auman, and Canton, because basically it was not legal for missionaries to enter into the main part of China. It certainly wasn't legal for the Chinese to help them. These two gentlemen might have paid very dearly for doing so. So Legge and Morrison set up a school in Malaya, in the town of Malacca, which had been a Dutch and Portuguese colony, called the Anglo-Chinese College. And Legge went out to teach there. That was the only place he could go to. But then history took an interesting turn, because as you all know, the first Opium War broke out between basically the Chinese and the British. And as a result of that war, this place where we're in right now, Hong Kong, was founded in 1842. That's another picture of Morrison. He was a very fine-looking man. And these are the buildings in Guangzhou, the Canton factories, which was where the foreigners had to live in a kind of ghetto, you know. China was very, very closed in those days. And you can see all the national flags there representing the different nationalities who were in Canton. So really, you know, when Legge went out, the possibilities were extremely limited. He had to content himself for a few years living in Malaya, in Malacca, and playing with his crocodile. And then eventually, and this is where Macau, which is where Morrison had to live. And it wasn't easy in Macau either, because they were all Catholics. And there was a huge amount of friction, of tension between the Catholics and the Protestants, and the non-conformists, like Morrison and Legge. Pictures of Macau. I always have to have pretty pictures of Macau, because nowadays, of course, it's completely changed. But when I was a young man, I used to go to Macau and just love it, because it was such a extraordinary corner of the world in which the colonial Baroque architecture had been preserved. And this is Malacca, you see, the old Dutch-Portuguese colony in Malaya. And of course, Legge, I mean, I don't think it's irrelevant to want to know about the personal lives of translators. I think it's very important, actually. And when we talk about later on, we talk about Arthur Waley and David Hawkes, I shall have quite a lot to say about their private lives, because I don't wish to pry, but I want to know who they were, because despite all the work of translation theorists, I actually believe that translators are human beings, and they have hearts that beat, and they have a physical body that exists in space and time. And anyway, this was the first Mrs. Legge. Her name was Mary. And she sailed out with James Legge on a boat to Malacca. Of course, in those days, you couldn't go through the Suez Canal because the Suez Canal didn't exist. So they had to go all the way around Africa, and it took them several months. And on board the ship, Mrs. Legge wrote in her journal that she observed Mr. Legge, her husband, her newly married husband, he liked to dress up in kind of sailor's gear in white and play with the sailors. I mean, he was obviously quite a character, this Mr. Legge. He wasn't going to pretend to be a sort of priest on board ship. He dressed up in white sailor's costume and joined in with all the deck games and things, and was very much part of the sort of, he entered into the fun. And he was rather a dashing-looking young man, Legge. I mean, most of the pictures one sees are of James Legge when he was rather older, but you see, he cut rather a fine figure as a young man. Now, so he gets to Malacca, and he's playing with his crocodile, and he's thinking about what he can do. And then, of course, all hell breaks loose because the First Opium War begins, and bang, 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 there are all the ships being blown up, and old Lin Zexu's burning the opium, and and then of course we all know what the end result was: the Treaty of Nanjing and the founding of the British colony of Hong Kong. I'm still allowed to call it that, even though now, of course, it's part of the Great Motherland. And of course, when Hong Kong was founded, it was a pretty rough place. It wasn't air conditioned and stuff. It was just a bunch of shacks, really, and but with lots of ships in the harbour, most of them containing large quantities of drugs. I mean, let's be honest about it. This was the drug centre of the world for rather a long time, and that was Hong Kong. Anyway, James Legge didn't lose much time. He came immediately to Hong Kong because he could see that this was the future. So he is really a Hong Kong person, Absolutely. If I had to name one outstanding British person connected with Hong Kong, it wouldn't be Chris Patton, It would be James Legge, He was a truly outstanding Hong Kong person. He spent at least half of his life here. And here he is looking a bit more serious now when he set up business in Hong Kong. And he built a church called the Union Church, and it's been rebuilt many times, but I gather there still is a Union Church up in mid-level somewhere. And he used to preach sermons 5 times a day. I mean, he was obviously even more of a talker than me, and he used to just give sermons 5 times a day. And as he got better and better at Chinese, he would even preach sermons in Chinese. And he used to visit the prisons, he used to visit the hospitals. He was a true man of the church. Incidentally, he became good at Chinese, but he couldn't speak northern Chinese. He spoke Cantonese, He spoke Cantonese, and apparently not very well. He didn't really, typical foreigner, he couldn't really have a good ear for tones, And as you all know, Cantonese tones are a bit of a nightmare, and there are so many of them. But if he spoke Chinese, what he spoke was Cantonese, not Mandarin. This was the church which was moved several times, the Union Church, where he preached his sermons. And he took with him from Malacca 3 young Chinese boys who had been converted to Christianity. And they were a bit like his, in addition to his crocodile, they were his 3 pets. I mean, he had these 3 young Chinese. He was very proud of them. And he, in fact, after a couple of years, he needed to go back to England for reasons of health. And he took these 3 young boys with him. And, that's the stamp, by the way. That's the stamp of James Legge, the $1 stamp from 1994, with a picture of the 3 boys in the background. And anyway, when James Legge went to England in whatever the date was, 1950 or something, it's on your handout, he was actually invited to present his 3 Chinese boys to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. You know, they could hardly speak English, these 2 people. They were, you know, they were Germans, basically. And, but anyway, apparently they were extremely friendly and nice, and James Legge had a great time showing off his 3 young Chinese converts. And here we are again in a very famous painting showing him with those 3 young men. And as time went by, he began to realize that in addition to his mission as a Christian preacher, he felt another really serious and really inspiring mission, which was to translate the Chinese classics. And it's a very interesting historical accident, if you like, although I don't believe there are any such things as accidents. But the first Opium War was what enabled James Legge to come to Hong Kong. And the second Opium War and the Taiping Rebellion, these 2 historical events, were what enabled him to really concentrate on his work, because with China in such a complete upheaval, there was really no possibility for him to travel in the hinterland of China. He had to just stay in Hong Kong and sort of, you know, stick to his work. So he ended up spending a lot of the 1950s, when all this was happening, all these chaotic. I mean, China was in such a state of chaos in the inner lands of China that he started to concentrate on translating the first of the Chinese classics, and he started off with the 3 of them, the Lunyu and the Da Xue and the Zhongyong. This is the mission house where he lived and where Mary, his wife, kept house and used to entertain. And this is rather a nice sketch of the building. The building no longer exists. And this is another title page from his Chinese classics. Now, the other thing that interests me about translators, as I think you all know, I'm a dedicated enemy of translation theory. I have been all my life. But the other thing that really interests me about translators is that, yes, they're human beings, and they have minds and bodies like every human being. They have to live, you know. They have to have a livelihood, and they have to have some way of paying the bills, you know. And in the case of James Legge, he had lots of children, many of whom died. But I mean, he still had a few that survived, and he was married twice. So he had a family to support and a way of life to support, and he needed to buy books and things like that. I know what it's like. I've had to do this all my life. Now, how on earth do you survive? Because it's very hard to survive as a translator, I can assure you, especially if you're translating literature, you know, because it doesn't make much money. It never does. It never will. And how did James Legge manage, you know, to produce this extraordinary, what can I call it, this legacy? I mean, he produced book after book after book. I mean, I've only brought one of the books with me, which is his translation of the Lunyu and the Da Xue and the Zhongyong. But you know, I worked for 12 years to translate the I Ching. I'm not trying to promote my book, by the way, but you know, it is available on Amazon.com if you wish to buy it. Anyway, I worked for 12 years on one book, the I Ching, and it took me 12 years, and I was almost, I couldn't really earn a living doing it, not at all. So how did someone like Legge manage to survive? Of course, he was being paid a salary as a missionary, but you see, the missionary work took up so much of his time that so he had to pay back. He had to do stuff for the mission. So how could he possibly produce these books? Very, very expensive to print books. Very expensive to set up the type. I mean, they're beautifully typeset and designed. Masterpieces of mid-19th century printing. Well, I think it's a fascinating story, and you know, it usually gets relegated to a footnote in all these books about post-colonial deconstructionists, whatever. But what happened was he was traveling on a boat on the Pearl River it was during the Taiping Rebellion, actually, and news reached them that there was an island occupied by Taiping rebels. So he said to the boat's captain, "Take me there, I want to speak to these people," because he thought they would probably be Christians of some sort. The Taipings were very odd Christians, as you know. So off they went on this boat towards this island, and Legge by this stage was speaking quite good Cantonese. So he talked to the ship's captain, and he talked to the people on the island. And now it so happened that on this boat was a gentleman by the name of Joseph Jardine. Now I'm sure you've all heard of Jardines, and he was one of the family of the Jardines who set up that big company, that Hong, the Jardine Matheson thing. And he was so impressed by James Legge's Chinese that he remembered it for many years. And one day he met James Legge and he said to him, and I just think this is a wonderful piece of dialogue, "We make our money in China." Well, we know they make their money by selling opium to the Chinese. Okay, "We make our money in China, and I think we should give some of it back to them." Now, these were bad guys. These were dealers in drugs. You know, I'm not trying to justify what they were doing, but I think they were also quite enlightened to become the patrons of this endeavor of James Legge's to translate the Chinese classics. And they basically bankrolled the whole project. They paid for the printing, the paper, the binding, everything. They didn't pay Legge a salary, but they paid the actual costs of publishing these books. Now, for me, that's an important fact. It reflects history, it reflects people, it reflects reality, and it shows how translation, at certain moments in history, can actually attract very enlightened patronage. And it's, you know, I'd like to meet Mr. Jardine myself one day, but, you know, but it won't be on a boat because I get seasick. And so I think that's a very interesting fact that should be in the main body of any text about James Legge, not in a footnote, you know. So he started work on, there's the first page of his Lunyu, you see. Now, look how beautifully set out it is. It's very interesting, and this brings me really to one of my main points, which is that one shouldn't underestimate the intelligence and imagination of this man who swung a crocodile around his head. He was really something. And he became very, very well read in the Chinese commentaries on the classics. I mean, he knew his way around Chinese. He was far more widely read than, for example, Robert Morrison, his predecessor. And what he decided to do, and there's honestly, none of the books I've read have made enough of this point. He decided to create an English parallel text translation in the style of a Chinese commentary. So you've got the main Chinese text, and note the main Chinese text is by far the biggest. It stands out. The same way as in Chinese commentaries, if you look at one of the great commentaries on the Lunyu, let's say Zhu Xi or somebody like that, the main text, 子曰什么什么, is in large type, right? And then the commentary is in smaller type. Now the way Legge did it, and he more or less invented this, you know, he was very creative. He had the Chinese in large type, then he had his translation in medium-sized type, so it's a bilingual piece of layout, and then underneath it, occupying usually at least half the page, is his commentary in very small type, but with lots of Chinese characters. And, you know, I've had this book for a very long time. I've been reading Legge ever since I was a student in 1966. But just in order to prepare for this visit of mine to Hong Kong, I started to reread a lot of James Legge, and his commentary is superb. I've got some examples I'm going to give you later on. But right now I just want to show you the layout of the first page. And he arrived at this format which he used again and again and again in his early classics. The Chinese text in beautiful type. He also paid a lot of money to get this very nice type. And then the translation, and then his footnotes, his commentary. They're not really footnotes, it's a commentary in the Chinese sense, with lots of Chinese characters. I mean, that takes a lot of work, you know. So it's very, very useful today. There's nothing that's anywhere like as good as this today. It's on a level of its own. What puts people off is that he uses a Romanization system which is it's certainly not Hanyu Pinyin, and it's not Wei Giles either. It's a sort of his development of Robert Morrison's Romanization system, and people have real trouble using it. For example, he calls book 1. I can use my little red thing, can't I? Try not to fall over. Oh yes, yeah. You see, that's how he writes xue er. You see, I mean, it's a very odd kind of Romanization, and you find that throughout his books, that Romanization makes it very hard for today's reader to read. And some enlightened patron like Joseph Jardine should pay a group of young academics to go through the whole of Legge and change the Romanization to Hanyu Pinyin so that today's people can read it, because nobody's going to write better English than Legge. And that brings me to my second main point about Legge. Not only that he was able to enter into the Chinese commentarial tradition, but because he was so widely read in the classics, in Latin and Greek, and in Hebrew, of course, as well, and he knew the Bible backwards, and he read and read and read. He wrote wonderful, what I would call late 19th century English. If you can get away from the format and just read his English, it's not stuffy at all. It's very fluent. It's very expressive. It's wonderful. And he could do that because he was a cultured man, because he had read and read, because he was devoured by a desire to read and to understand. He was that kind of a person. He wasn't a boring translator. He wasn't at all. He was actually a very exciting translator. So that's the first page of his Lunyu. Now, again, this is a bit like the crocodile story, you see. I mean, James Legge had various Chinese collaborators, but the one that worked with him the longest was this man Wang Tao. And Wang Tao was a very interesting man who got into trouble. He was from Suzhou, and he was quite he was what we would call a gifted Wenren. He was a man of letters who did some of the degrees. I can't remember how far he got, probably Juren. And he got into trouble in China because they accused him of working for the Taiping rebels. And so he escaped to Shanghai. And in Shanghai he was protected by one of the missionaries and the son of the missionary who was the British consul. So Wang Tao escaped from China and then later escaped from Shanghai to Hong Kong. And when he got to Hong Kong, he joined up with James Legge and worked with him for about 20 years, helping him as a Chinese assistant. He did a huge amount of work for James Legge, preparing editions, comparing commentaries. I mean, he was really his collaborator. A bit like you have real collaborators like Yang Xianyi and Gladys Yang. James Legge and Wang Tao were like this, And if you know anything about Wang Tao, it's quite hard to imagine, because there's James Legge, a Congregationalist minister who's preaching sermons 5 times a day on Sunday. And there's Wang Tao, who is notorious for his lifestyle. He liked wine, women, and song in that order. And he was always spending his time, on the flower boats and having a good time. And I mean, so James Legge was able, he was able to see beyond. He wasn't going to condemn this man just because of his lifestyle. He admired him enormously for his intellectual abilities. He wrote so himself. He said, "This is the most extraordinarily learned and intelligent scholar. I'm so lucky to have him." And they worked together for about 20 years. And even after Wang Tao went back to China, James Legge continued to benefit from the work he'd done. For example, on the I Ching, Wang Tao prepared a whole series of commentaries for James Legge. And later on, when James Legge went back to Scotland for a bit of a rest, he went back for a couple of years, he invited Wang Tao to come and stay with him in Scotland. And that would have been quite something to witness. I'd love to have been there at that house party with Wang Tao and James Legge and all his family. For 2 years they lived together in Scotland. And Wang Ta, you know, he ended up going back to Shanghai and becoming a very, very important figure in the Shanghai literary world as a journalist, as a writer of fiction. He wrote a whole series of stories in the style of Liao Zhai Zhi Yi. You know, I think they were just called Hou Liao Zhai. And they were all, you know, kind of naughty stories written by Wang Ta. And he wrote this long piece about James Legge, a beautifully written piece. And if I've got time, I'll go over it with you later. And he also he wrote a kind of account of his travels to Europe, which was illustrated and published. I mean, this is supposed to be the British Museum. I can't quite understand what's going on. There's a very large fish. There seems to be a very large fish. I suppose he thinks that's what a museum's all about. And then there's some cattle there. But that was Wang Ta's illustrator. And this was his version of Paris, you know. It looks like Shanghai. And then this is him. You can kind of see him. He's wandering around like a Chinese hermit, you know, in the mountains in Scotland. Dollar was the name of the village where James Legge lived. And, you know, and this was his picture. These are the picture of Hong Kong to illustrate Wang Ta's book. And this was Edinburgh and so on. And this photograph, which is absolutely a classic. I mean, look at him. This is Wang Ta. He looks like a servant, you know. He looks like James Legge's #1 boy, you know. That's Wang Ta, you see. I mean, and can you imagine what it would have been like in the Legge household? I mean, what do you think all the young children made of this guy? I mean, look at him. There he is. And I don't think he spoke any English. I mean, I think James Legge had to interpret for him. But, you know, it would make a good movie, actually. But I think the crocodile would have to play a very big part. And this is the countryside near Dollar. See, again, this superb Scottish countryside, and which tells us a great deal about James Legge, because James Legge, I can imagine, was the kind of person who'd go out for about a 5-hour walk, you know. He was a very vigorous man. Now, it's very sad, but his first wife died. I mean, I don't think that Hong Kong suited her, the climate and so on. But when he came back to England, James Legge very soon married again to a lady. She was a widow, actually, and this is the second Mrs. Legge. Her name was Hannah, and she bore him several children. I mean, he had, I think, at least four children by his first wife, but most of them died. I mean, terrible rates of child mortality in those days. Now, you see, I don't think this is irrelevant. I think translators are human beings, and I think when your children die at a very young age, it's a terrible blow. And I think that if your wife, his wife was in her 30s when she died, his first wife, this is all part of your experience, you know. And I think the way I understand it is that this suffering was something that actually pushed James Legge to work even harder at his almost obsessive project with the Chinese classics. But also, if you read his commentary, it also made him more human, you know. And I hope to show you some of that later on. Now, I've kind of gone whizzing ahead because by this stage, I'm calling him Professor Legge, you see. And by this stage, I'm talking about the 1870s. And by now, he's left Hong Kong, and he's gone back to England, and he's become the first professor of Chinese at Oxford University. Now, Oxford University is my own university, so I feel a particularly strong link. We're now roundabout in the year 1876. That's when he gave his first inaugural lecture at Oxford. And you see, by this stage he was already over 60 years old, and beginning his second career. Having been a missionary since the age of about 20, he now becomes a professor. And he settles down in Oxford for the rest of his life. He hardly leaves Oxford at all. Now, to return to my theme of translators being human beings, I mean, okay, so you're a human being and you have experiences and you love and you live and you do all that and you suffer and you're sad and you're happy and you explore life and so on. But you also find yourself in an environment. You find yourself part of often a kind of a culture in that other sense, which consists of your friends, your contemporaries, the people that you mingle with, the people that you associate with. They become part of your life and they influence you. I mean, like for example today I find myself in the audience here with several people who I've known for like getting on for 30 years. They're part of my environment. They're the people I continually keep running up against because we've gone through stuff together. And you see, if someone was to try and understand me, not that anyone could ever be bothered to do that, but I mean, I'm not sufficiently important. But if someone was to try and write in, say, 50 years' time, when I'm already, I've gone to join Karl Marx and Mao Zedong and all the other great friends I'm looking forward to meeting on the other side. I mean, if someone then tries to find out what sort of person I was, they wouldn't be wrong to try looking at who my friends were, because, it's an old saying that to know a man, know his friends. What kind of people were your friends? Who did you mingle with? Who were your contemporaries? What sort of a world did you live in? And I mean by world, I mean more than like physical space. I mean, the old idea of Jingjie, the universe that you inhabit, the realm that you are part of. Do you mingle with people who play tennis? Do you mingle with people who play music? Do you mingle with people who paint pictures? Do you mingle with, etc., etc.? Who are your friends? And doesn't that help to find out who you are, And now in the case of James Legge, once he went to Oxford, and that's why I mentioned earlier on Wang Tao, because Wang Tao was for 20 years, was probably Legge's closest collaborator and friend. And Wang Tao speaks of him as a friend. And yet Wang Tao was what we would call today a bon viveur. He liked to enjoy life, He didn't go and preach sermons. He went off to the tea houses and the sing-song houses and had a good time, That's Wang Tao. And he was completely unashamed about it. And that's what you did, And all his friends in Shanghai would have done the same thing. And yet this man was one of Legge's closest friends and collaborators. Doesn't that tell you something about Legge? And then when he went to Oxford, he found himself in another milieu, another world. Oxford is an extraordinary place, Oxford, nowadays it's just a sort of famous university and it gets ratings of such and such. No, Oxford in the 19th century was a remarkably creative place, full of remarkable people. And, England was going through huge upheavals as people discovered that Christianity wasn't necessarily the answer to everything. And this is the Sheldonian Theatre in Oxford, a beautiful building designed by the great architect Christopher Wren, and that's where James Legge gave his inaugural lecture. And this is All Souls College, one of the most beautiful and elite colleges in Oxford. David Hawkes was a fellow of All Souls College. I mean, Oxford is the most extraordinarily beautiful city. And this is a caricature of Legge, you see, when he was the first professor of Chinese with a pigtail, and a kind of Chinese teapot dressed up in the robes of a mandarin. So you can see he was probably regarded as something of an eccentric, even by his contemporaries. And there he is on the right, again, dressed up in Chinese robes. I mean, he was a figure of fun, and I'm sure he didn't mind at all. These were some of his contemporaries. I'm not going to go into them at great length. I talked about him on Thursday. These are great figures in the Oxford of Legge's day, and he knew them all well. He could stand shoulder to... this previous guy translated Socrates. I talked about him on Thursday. This is the great Walter Pater, a very exact contemporary of James Legge's, who preached a different gospel. He was the great philosopher behind what was called the aesthetic movement. And Walter Pater, one of my absolute favorite writers of all time. And from that you can know a lot about me, you see. You can learn about people from what they read as well, or what kind of music they listen to, what songs they sing, That's what interests me. Not whether they were post-colonial or pre-colonial or whatever. Walter Pater's great disciple, of course, was the wonderful Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde, I could give 10 lectures about Oscar Wilde, but I won't, of course. And he, just for your interest, Oscar Wilde read the translation of Zhuangzi when it appeared in the 1880s, the translation by Herbert Giles, who I'll be talking about next week. And when Oscar Wilde read Zhuangzi in English, he just said, this is the most important book ever written. It's the most modern book. I mean, Oscar Wilde immediately understood everything that Zhuangzi was saying. This is the world of Oxford in the 1880s, 1870s. John Ruskin. John Ruskin was a giant of a man. And look at what he said. Remember that the most beautiful things in the world are the most useless. Peacocks and lilies, for instance. I mean, John Ruskin was an exact contemporary of James Legge. And so, of course, was the great Lewis Carroll. Again, an Oxford academic, but an eccentric. I mean, as you know, Lewis Carroll used to take photographs of young girls. I mean, he would be in prison today. But no, he would, seriously, he'd be in prison, or he would be electronically, whatever, castrated or something. And, but he was a genius, you know, he was a mathematician, and he had an extraordinary gift. And of course, he created Alice, you know. I mean, anyone who created Alice is immortal, you know, immortal. And there she is with the bottle saying, drink me, you know. And she was based on a young girl that Lewis Carroll used to take boating on the River Thames. And then there was the wonderful Matthew Arnold, who wrote that, my favorite poem in the English language, The Scholar Gypsy, about being free from the shackles of academic life. And then, of course, these are later people in Oxford. These are much later, but you have Tolkien. You have Philip Pullman. These are all what I would call Oxford creative figures. And it's a great tradition in Oxford. It's the only one I can actually subscribe to. I mean, the wonderful tradition of the Oxford eccentric, the Oxford creative. There are many others I could have put there. And anyway, James Legge joined Oxford, and he was clearly very comfortable in his chair, you know. You can see he was having a rather nice time smoking his pipe with his feet up, and he's wearing slippers. You see, he's wearing good old-fashioned slippers. And, you know, so much for the terrible legend that he was a stuffy, boring, daunting, unlikable. No, he was a wonderful person, and his children always wrote very fondly of him, you know. And he was clearly what we would call today a very genial person, a very nice person to meet. This is one of his letters he wrote to somebody wrote, one of his cousins wrote about some tea that she'd seen, and there's his handwriting. I'm afraid it's rather badly reproduced on this slide, but you at least, there's his signature. You see James Legge, and you can see he just writes a bit of Chinese, and he's just writing a friendly letter, you know, and he was well known to be willing to help people, you know, help anybody really. And this was, you know, he had to teach. There weren't many students in those days. He might have had 2 or 3, you know. Wonderful workload, you know, for today's academic. But this was his last lesson that was left on the blackboard when it was still there when he died. You know, Shan Shang You San Ren. You know, I mean, I always remember this as being Shan Shang You Mu, which is from the I Ching, but actually no. He was just teaching colloquial Chinese. You see, there were 3 people on the hill, etc., you know. And then, I mean, I wouldn't say he wrote the most wonderful Chinese, but I mean, his hand was not exactly, if you compare it with, for example, David Hawkes has written Chinese, which I'll be showing you in a few weeks. David Hawkes wrote the most beautiful Chinese characters, but I don't think Legge particularly cared about the beauty of his characters. And this is Legge's grave in the churchyard in North Oxford, where I've often been, Wolvercote. That's his grave. And this is the man who delivered the funeral speech. There again, you see, if you want to find out about people, something that's important is to find out what happens when they die, you know. Sometimes people die and everybody just wants to forget them straight away, you know. They just think, good riddance to bad rubbish, thank goodness that guy's out the way, you know. And sometimes people die and there's just an overwhelming outpouring of grief, you know. When I was here in 2013, in January, my very dear friend P.K. Liang Bingjun, he died, and I was asked to give a speech at his funeral, and I was one of the pallbearers. And it was an unforgettable funeral because there were so many people who came. They had to open up another hall. There were just literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of his students and colleagues just wanting to come and mourn for his. He was too young when he died, and he was such a brilliant and generous spirit. And you know, if you had the misfortune never to know this wonderful man, and you could look at his funeral, you could look at what people say, you can read what they say afterwards, and you can learn a great deal. And the same is true of this man. He read the most wonderful speech at Legge's memorial service, which I'll read to you at the end because I think it's so good. I think that's pretty much my last picture, actually, of the same guy. So I think I've exhausted my pictures now. We'll just have to think about words. So if we can turn to the handout. If you turn to page 6 of your handout, I've got some concrete things I'd like to talk about. I've tried to summarize my own views about all of these. For example, if you look underneath the heading, Instructive Examples, the first one, these are all taken from the first volume of the Chinese classics as republished in Taiwan. I have a copy of it with me. And that includes the Lunyu, the Da Xue, Zhongyong, and Mengzi. And when he's talking about the Da Xue, on pages 33 to 34, Legge, I think he writes with great warmth and sincerity of purpose. He says, excellence must, he's agreeing with the Da Xue, you see. He's not contradicting it. He says, excellence must be rooted in the state of the heart. It must be the natural outgrowth of internal sincerity. I mean, he's thinking like a Chinese person. And then he quotes from the Bible, but not trying to preach, but just saying it's the same, you see. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. This is the teaching. These are the eternal verities, the eternal truths, alike of Solomon and of the author of the great learning, the Da Xue. And you see, that line, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he, that comes from the Bible, from the Proverbs of Solomon. So, I think you can tell from something like that the Legge is not going out of his way to sort of attack the Chinese. You know, he's trying to find common ground. He's trying to find a universal mind. And for me, that's very inspiring. Anyway, when you come onto the actual translation of the Lunyu, what really struck me this time rereading it was that one of the very creative things Legge did was to devise a layout that to a large extent reflected the traditional Chinese layout, where you have the main text in large Chinese characters, and then you have different levels that get smaller and smaller. And this is his commentary, you see. And because it's in such small type, I don't think many people bother to read it. I think these people who write long academic works, they can't even be bothered to read it. But actually, if you read it carefully, it's very well written, and it's extremely interesting. And you know that here's a very intelligent mind at work. And going back to page 6, I just jotted down some of the examples where Legge actually takes time out in his commentary to discuss key words from the Lunyu, such as 君子, 学, 道, 事, 理, 政, 天下, 人, 中人数. I mean, you know, in a way that's a very modern approach. I mean, he actually takes time out when these key words first appear to discuss them in a very intelligent and sympathetic way. And as I said underneath that, he is capable in so doing of being both wise and humorous, and always adopts a sympathetic tone, never sneering or condescending. You see, nowadays, the sort of trendy way to do things, if you take a book like Roger Ames and David Hall's book, Thinking Through Confucius, is it's very aggressively kind of Western analytical philosophy, and it doesn't have any of the sympathy of Legge. It also doesn't have any of the warmth and humor. And I find that what people write about Legge is so wrong. He's such a warm and humorous person, and so sympathetic. So let's take that very famous passage where Confucius says, I want to ride a raft, and float on the sea, and who will come with me? And he says, 道不行, my way of thinking is not current. Well, Legge translates it, my doctrines make no way. I will get upon a raft and float about on the sea. He that will accompany me will be Yo, I dare to say. Now you see, that's quite a controversial passage. I mean, what strikes me about Legge's Lunyu is that he really seems to have a picture of this individual called Confucius, who was a very odd person. I mean, honestly, if you read the Lunyu today, go home and read it like it's a novel, you'll find this individual man, Kongzi, to be really quite an eccentric, a man after James Legge's heart. I mean, you might as well find that Confucius liked to have a pet crocodile and wave it around his head, because clearly, I mean, some of the things Confucius says are really most bizarre, Well, this is one of them, I just want to get on a raft and go floating on the sea. Well, what on earth did he mean, And anyway, in his commentary, you see, Legge writes, Confucius proposing to withdraw from the world, a lesson to Zelu. Zelu supposed his master really meant to leave the world, and the idea of floating along the coasts pleased his ardent temper. You see, he's being slightly humorous here. But Confucius only expressed in this way his regret at the backwardness of men to receive his doctrines. So he's being humorous, but he's also being very perceptive. And sometimes Legge, he's very personal. Sometimes he really doesn't know what the Chinese means. And in this, he's very similar to the great Song critic Zhu Xi. Zhu Xi sometimes just writes, I have no idea what this means. Most people think of Zhu Xi as being rather a boring old neo-Confucian, But actually, I studied his commentary on the I Ching quite carefully. And several places, Zhu Xi just says, I have no idea what this means. It's very dark. He often says it's very dark, I can't work it out. Well, thank goodness he's being honest, because frankly, nobody knows what the I Ching means, And Legge says on several occasions, he said, and here I give an example from page 177, there is hardly another chapter more perplexing to the translator. In other words, I really don't know what this means. And sometimes his translation is so beautifully concise and simple and accurate. Take this famous passage where his disciple Zelu says to Confucius, I would like to hear your zhi, your wishes, and Legge translates it, I should like, sir, to hear your wishes. The master said, Ziyue, they are in regard to the aged, to give them rest, anzhi, right? In regard to friends, to show them sincerity, xinzhi. In regard to the young, to treat them tenderly. Now that's a beautiful translation. I mean, people wrote good English in those days, I'm afraid nowadays I can't say that for most of my academic acquaintances. I mean, they really did, Legge really knew how to write good English. And so do all four of the people I'm talking about, Giles, Whaley, and Hawkes. The one thing they absolutely knew how to do was to write good English. And the trouble is, I know this is being recorded, but I can't resist saying it. The trouble is that so many of the so-called authoritative books published today are written by people who can't write English, but who also can't read English, And that's what makes me very angry, because none of them are capable of appreciating the beauty of James Legge's late Victorian English. And that makes me very, very angry. And there's the next part is also very famous. And I think that here again, Legge's translation is both thoughtful and sincerely conceived. The master said, the wise find pleasure in water, you see. 知之乐水. The virtuous find pleasure in hills. 乐山, it's a very, very famous, of course, it's become a chengyu, you know. The wise are active, 动. The virtuous are tranquil, 静. The wise are joyful, the virtuous are long-lived. And then his commentary, contrasts of the wise and the virtuous. The wise or knowing are active and restless, like the waters of a stream, ceaselessly flowing and advancing. The virtuous are tranquil and firm, like the stable mountains. The pursuit of knowledge brings joy. The life of the virtuous may be expected to glide calmly on and long. And then he adds, this is what I love about Legge, he adds a little final sentence. After all, the saying is not very comprehensible. In other words, I don't really know what it means, but like any good translator, I can fake it, you know. So he writes a beautiful translation, and then he says, actually, I don't really know what it means. And that's at least honest, you know. And sometimes his translation is very personal and very direct, as in the very famous 子在川上月, the master standing by a stream said, "It passes on just like this, not ceasing day or night." And his commentary, how Confucius was affected by a running stream. The words indicate something in the sage's mind, suggested by the ceaseless movement of the water. Very simple and very direct and very personal. And if we jump down the page a bit, because I'm slightly short of time, but page 206, he makes the comment, "We wish that our information about Confucius were not so stinted and fragmentary." Well, so do I, you know. I mean, the Lunyu is incredibly fragmentary. And Legge is very honest. I mean, he was an extremely honest man, with very few prejudices at all. And sometimes his commentary is so wonderfully well written as a form of cultural explanation. Take the famous saying, you know, page 219, 子曰, you know, 蜂鸟不至，何不出图，无义乎. And he says, the master said, the feng bird does not come, the river sends forth no map. It is all over with me. A most extraordinary passage from the Lunyu. What the hell does it mean? Anyway, Legge produces a wonderful commentary. For want of auspicious omens, Confucius gives up the hope of the triumph of his doctrines. The feng is the male of a fabulous bird, which has been called the Chinese phoenix, said to appear when a sage ascends the throne or when right principles are going to triumph. The female is called Huang. In the days of Shun, they gamboled in the hall and were heard singing on Mount Qi in the time of King Wen, I think it is. Yep. The river and the map carry us farther back still, to the time of Fu Xi, to whom a monster with the head of a dragon and the body of a horse rose from the water, being marked on the back so as to give that first of the sages the idea of his diagrams. Well, when I come to talk about David Hawkes on my last lecture, I shall be talking about the way he writes footnotes, but he incorporates them into the text, because he realizes how much explanation the English reader needs to understand the cultural environment of that novel. Well, Legge is doing exactly the same thing, but he's doing it in a very, very carefully thought out way as part of his Chinese-style commentary. It's not a footnote in the traditional Western sense. He has transformed the footnote idea into a commentary. He's a commentator, and several Chinese recognize that. And now we come to the last part, where I put together some of the tributes and conclusions, which I feel are worth noting. There's a good book that came out recently by a person I don't know from Baptist University called Wang Hui, and but in the whole book, this is what I find so extraordinary about today's academic publications. The most interesting bit in the entire book is hidden away in a footnote. And it's actually this statement by a Qing dynasty scholar by the name of Chen Qiyuan, in his book called Yongxian Zhai Biji, and he's talking about James Legge. And this is quite a well-respected Chinese Wenren, who obviously knows a bit about James Legge. And he says, "I cannot help but dance with joy, you see, to hear that the doctrines of our sages have now become available to the people of the Western Sea, the Xihairen. James Legge has proven himself to be a man of culture and courage, 孟子所谓豪杰之士也, by studying the way of our sages through the commentaries. You see, he's immediately associating Legge with a commentator so as to transform the Western barbarians, you see. 用下变异. So I mean, so far from Legge being some colonial missionary, here he is being recognized by a Chinese as somebody who's actually changing the West by translating the Lunyu. I mean, what greater tribute could you have than that? I mean, in my life as a translator, one of the most pleasing pieces of feedback I ever had, well, I don't think I should go into this. Anyway, I mean, I think it's very important that James Legge was recognized by a contemporary Chinese man of letters as having performed a service to Chinese culture. And through that, he may even change the wretched Western barbarians, people like myself, who will be greatly improved by reading the Chinese classics. I think that's absolutely wonderful. I think James Legge would be sitting there puffing his pipe, you know, with his crocodile and saying, good on you, you know. And I'm going to bore you because I'm going to read the eulogy given by the Reverend Fairbairn, because he was a very wonderful man. We'll have to go skipping through to the end. I think the previous picture is even better, yes. This is the man who gave the speech at James Legge's funeral. And he wrote, it's such a beautiful speech. I've read it several times, and I don't think it's a bad idea to inflict it upon you. He said, and because what he says to me describes a real person, you know. I really can imagine James Legge when I read this. This man was his friend, you see. That was his friend. James Legge had a largeness and simplicity of nature. That's such an incredibly powerful thing to say about somebody. Am I doing something wrong? Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. He had a largeness and simplicity of nature. That's a very powerful thing to say about somebody, and was distinguished by a dignity which never fails to adorn the single-minded man. Yes, Legge was single-minded. He was dedicated. He got up at 3 o'clock in the morning. When did you last get up at 3 o'clock in the morning? Except when you were having trouble sleeping, you know. I mean, it's quite an achievement, you know. He was, though so upright, he was as gentle as a child. And while severely conscientious, he was saved by his delightful humor from being either fierce or fanatical. These are all things I can see in his translation. That's why I like this speech so much. Oxford did not know him until the shadows of his long and gracious evening were about to fall, but it saw him soon enough to know that he was a man of fine presence, of pure purpose, and of courageous speech, a man whose high spirit a small school and imperfect sympathy could not break, whose wide and lofty aims a circumscribed sphere could neither narrow nor lower. He was sent eastwards to the oldest of living civilizations, and he studied it with an eye made luminous by love. Now, what a beautiful sentence that is. If someone ever said to me that I did something with an eye made luminous by love, I'd probably burst into tears. I mean, it means that his eyes shone with a light that was made of love, you know. And that's true. That's what I sense from reading Legge's translations. He wrote, with an eye made luminous by love. His love cast light through his eyes. Now, if that isn't about the best thing you can say about a translator, I don't know what is. For if ever a man loved a people, James Legge loved the Chinese, and he could not bear to see them do wrong or suffer it. And he was not a man to see that happen which he hated, without straining every nerve to prevent it. I'll jump a couple of lines. He gained the affection and confidence of the Chinese as but few foreigners have ever done, for he loved them truly. See how many times he's using the word love. And they knew the simple integrity of his love. The simple integrity of his love. It was characteristic of him that one of his very last acts was to rise from what was to be his deathbed to greet with his fine old world courtesy a Chinese youth of humble origin and rank, whose only claim to such attention was the blood which ran in his veins. And as he loved the people, he was jealous for all that was good and true in their faith. Did he not judge with charity as well as knowledge? Charity here is another word for love, for generosity of spirit. And I would say that that was one of the qualities of Legge's work. He had the insight which comes of the heart, even more than of the head, into their literature and religion. And he saw that the primary condition of making the West influential in the East was to make the East intelligible to the West. Out of this understanding came his magnificent edition of the Chinese classics. Of its learning it does not become me to speak. The invincible patience. Do you remember I spoke on Thursday of Leonardo da Vinci's definition of genius? He said, genius is eternal patience. And my goodness, James Legge had endless amounts of patience. He was single-minded, he was hard-working, he was dedicated. He had invincible patience. The heroic industry that went into its production, we can all admire. But only those who knew the man can appreciate the idea, the splendid dream of humanity and religion that gave it birth. I honestly don't think I can think of anything better to say than that. So I think I'll stop there and invite questions. Thank you very much.
Professor Minford, this is Margaret Chu. I have been trying to work on a bit of translation, but very much as a beginner and forever a beginner. I was wondering, and I find, of course, it extremely difficult to do so, being in a way neither a native speaker of Chinese nor a native speaker of English. Being born in Hong Kong, so we kind of learned both sort of halfway. I wondered how you yourself, as also a person who translates a lot, handle the difficulties of understanding the text sometimes in their context. I try to do New Confucian texts, the Songming Lixue people. How do you manage to bring them alive, and also sometimes not feeling actually what you're reading?
Not feeling what?
Not feeling the sentences of what we're reading.
Have you finished? I mean,
yes.
Yeah?
Thank you very much.
Okay. That's an extremely difficult question to answer, because I think it varies from one text to another. I'm still very much living in the shadow of the last book I published, which is the I Ching. I worked on that for 12 years. And your question, therefore, resonates with that for me. And I would say the I Ching must be one of the most obscure books ever written in any language, And I spent all that time trying to understand it and trying to translate it. And my answer is probably going to surprise you and maybe shock you, but towards the end, during the last 3 or 4 years of my work on the I Ching, I started to actually hear a voice. I mean, I actually began to feel that, because the Chinese say about the I Ching, it's not a book, it's a spirit. It's not a shu, it's a shen, And it's actually not it isn't a book in any normal sense of the word. It doesn't have a beginning or an end, it goes round and round. It doesn't have an author. It's not even a book that's supposed to be read, it's supposed to be consulted, So with that book, I found myself, I think the word is channeling. You channel a voice. you actually end up hearing a voice, and you surrender to it. I was interviewed by a mainland website, which I'm sure you all know about, called Tongxun, and this interviewer asked me a similar question, and I used the word surrender, and of course the young lady had no idea what I was talking about, and used the word in a military sense, like I was handing over victory to the enemy, you see. I don't mean that. I mean surrender in the sense of love, devotion, surrender, you know. You surrender yourself. You surrender yourself. Sometimes people say that about you surrender yourself to another person. You surrender yourself to a cause. In this case, I surrender myself to the Spirit, you know. And I decided in the end that it must be something that runs in my family, because my sister is actually a psychic medium, and she actually communicates with the spirits of the departed. That's her job. That's her profession. She's very successful in her profession and charges a lot of money. And you know, it's because she's very good at it, basically. And her spirit guide is actually called Old Chinese, you know. This is an extraordinary fact. And I'm not like that. I'm not a psychic medium. I'm not about to go into a trance and start, you know, I promise you. But I think that in this case, translation became a process like that, whereby I started to actually sense a vibration, to use the old hippie word, you know, a vibration that was not me and it wasn't the book, it was something else. It was a spirit traveling through that book. And I think that this is beginning to sound like translation theory, which would be appalling because I don't believe in translation theory. But I think in the end this can be applied to all kinds of translation, because, you know, there is a stage at which you cease to be yourself and the other book ceases to be, the other person ceases to be another person, and you actually become one. And that's when the voice is neither you nor he or she. And I think that you know that, you sense that. And it doesn't happen all the time. Sometimes you end up, I mean, I'm speaking like I know something. I don't know anything, but I mean, sometimes at the end of a project, I feel I don't know the voice, and therefore I know I've failed. And sometimes I feel I do know the voice, and I can't tell you why. I mean, I remember giving a talk at the Baptist University about 8 years ago about my work on the I Ching. And a very dear friend of mine, who you might know, called Zhongling, she writes poetry, and she was the dean at the Baptist. She said in question time, John, when will you know if it's working? Because I said in that talk, I remember I said, I think this is magic. I think this book is magic. And I don't know how I'm ever going to get it right. And she asked me the question, how will you ever know? And I said rather flippantly, oh, I'll send you a postcard, you know. And I have never sent her a postcard, but there came a point at which I knew it was working. Now that sounds arrogant, if you like, but it's not arrogant. It's really just a matter of surrendering and letting go. And at the end, of course, you have to do all the preparatory work. I mean, I worked for about 9 years before I started to feel this process taking over. And once it took over, I just handed over the reins, and it was no longer in my hands, you know. And that's a bit of an odd reply to your question. Does it anyway, in any sense, answer your question? Or? It does. Okay, thank you.
Wondering that you said you spent 12 years working on that book, right? And what was the process like? Like, when did you start to translate the first chapter, or you read it through, and what kind of work did you do to get to know the text and get yourself surrendered to it?
Okay. I'm happy to answer that question because it's pretty simple. I would say that I spent the first 2 or 3 years exploring, getting hold of different texts, finding out what other people had got to say, learning about the history, you know, just studying really. That was the first stage. And then I think, you know, having talked about James Legge, who I revere, I mean, he's such an extraordinary person, I have to be quite honest and say I'm more or less the complete opposite. If James Legge was a very rigorous, methodical person, I am the opposite. I'm not at all rigorous, I'm not at all methodical. Anyone who knows me will tell you that. And I am the person I am therefore the translator that I am. and I have to work in my own way. My own way is not a way I would recommend to anybody else, but it suits me. It's the only way I can do it. And in the case of the I Ching, I had to make a start at some point. I had to say, okay, that's enough now. Enough reading, enough studying. Now, jump in the deep end, start. So I started, and that's how I began. And I wrote 27 revisions of that book. In other words, I revised it totally 27 times. And I had the great good fortune to have an in-house editor, my wife, who is a very brilliant, has a brilliant command of English, and she also read my revisions, not 27 times, but probably 3 or 4 times. She went through the whole thing and criticized it and so on. So I do believe that revision, for me, is the substitute for method. I mean, I just go back again and again and again to what I've done, and every time I go back, I change a huge amount, and usually I try and allow some time to go by. I put it in a drawer for a few weeks, and I know this sounds very unhelpful, but I've never been able to hurry things up, I used to consult the I Ching a lot about the translation, because it's great to have a book that talks back to you, Not many books do, but the I Ching does. And, I would get letters from my publisher, very nice guy, saying, when could we hope for the manuscript? This is when it was already 5 years after deadline, right? And they were very polite, and I would consult the I Ching, you see, and the I Ching would always come up with the same gua, which is jian, gradual, right? So I could write back to my publisher and say, the book says I need to take my time. Right? It's been waiting for more than 2,000 years. It's in no hurry at all, right? And I have to say I was very, very lucky to have an extremely nice publisher at the head of Penguin Books in New York called John Siciliano. And I wrote in my acknowledgements, he's a true gentleman, He knows when to wait. And he knew that if he tried to hurry me up, it would be counterproductive anyway. And so I was just taking my time, which I had to do because the book told me so. And then he said to me in 2012, he said, John, should I be gentle or should I be harsh? And I wrote back and I said, the book says be gentle, So he was gentle, and I didn't even promise him anything for Christmas, because usually I say, I'll try and get you something by Christmas. But after about 6 Christmases had gone by, and he had nothing, finally he wrote to me in January 2013 and said, John, I've put it in the catalogue for this coming fall. End of email. That was it. So suddenly, I woke up one morning and realized, he said, I need it by April the 15th. I realized I had 3 months left in which to, try to finish what was an unfinishable project. Because you can never finish the I Ching. It's constantly going to be puzzling, far more so than Lunyu, And I don't have a crocodile, because I don't have any magical method of sorting out the problems. So I suddenly had to finish it. So I worked non-stop for 3 months, really non-stop, to get it off to him. I sent it off on the 15th of April, and then I heard nothing for 3 months, not a word back. And of course, I assumed the worst. I decided, oh well, it's 7 years over deadline, he's decided to reject it, And I thought, what shall I do now? I've wasted 12 years of my life. This is the reality of being a translator, you don't know what's going to happen. And then one morning, I got an email saying, oh, I loved your translation, it's so great, blah, blah, blah. We're going to have it out in whatever, October. And, I think that these things are all governed by fate. I'm not very helpful in my recommendations because it doesn't help you very much to walk out of here and think it's all to do with fate. But I mean, you see, in January 2014, some 9 months later, after which I'd managed to do all the proofreading and everything, I had a very severe stroke, and I was in hospital for about 6 months. So if I hadn't finished it, I probably wouldn't have finished it even now, because some projects require a huge amount of physical and mental energy, You know, they really are very, very demanding. And the I Ching was something like that, you know. And so there was a kind of dynamic going on between me and the publisher, because we've known each other for many years. And I mean, in the end, it all worked out fine. And thank goodness he finally pressed the button and said, send it to me on April the 15th. Otherwise, I might still be waiting to send it to him now, you see. So, I mean, I've not really answered your question, I'm sorry, but I mean, I just jump in the deep end, and then I keep revising and revising and revising. That's really my method. I would say the same was true of the last big book before that, which I did, was Liao Zhai Zhi Yi. And I spent about 4 years doing what I call preparatory reading, just reading and reading and reading. English stuff, Chinese stuff. And then I would plunge in the deep end and do some rough drafts, you know. I've done rough drafts of the whole of Liao Zhai. And then I would pick out 104 stories for my little selection and revise, probably at least 20 times. Revision is my method. It's the only, because it's like polishing until the thing shines, you know, until you can hear a voice. That's my only method. I have no other method at all. You know, I mean, I'm always being asked, I say always, but a surprisingly large number of students want to write something about my method. And I have to write back to them and say, I have no method, you know. I have no theory. I did an interview with a whole bunch of students from Baptist. They wanted to prove that I was somehow fitting into the Skopos theory of transit. I mean, I have no idea what they were talking about. I invited them to coffee and gave them cake, you know, and said, look, I'm sorry, I'm going to be a big disappointment to you because I have no theory. Nor did David Hawkes, nor did Arthur Whaley, nor did Herbert Giles, nor did James Legge, nor did, you know, Jesus Christ. I mean, what can I say, you know? I can only tell the truth. And I don't believe that there's too much harm in telling the truth. Anyway, that's all I have to say. I'm sorry.
Professor Minford, you have studying these two great books, Art of War and also Law of Changes. I think no more in this world probably study these kind of books more serious than you did. Tells us something about the significance of these two great books to modern people. Some people use these books to predict stocks, some predict political change, some people to predict probably financial sectors and other matters in life. Some people use this as a superstitious things. What is your true understanding of these two great books?
It costs you to ask me the most impossible question. I mean, you know how to keep people on their toes, don't you? I mean, can I change your question? Okay. Can we get rid of the Sons of Big Club? Because I don't like that book. I think it's a nasty book, and I'd rather forget it. I did it for the month. I mean, can't take us how to live. Sorry, I've got one here. No, so if we just talk about the I Ching, right? What do I think is the significance of this book? Do you have about 10 hours for me to talk about it? I mean, I can only give you my personal view, and that's all I can give. Because as you say, people use it for 100 different things, you know. And I had the great pleasure when I was in Hong Kong last, working at Chinese U, to meet a professor of business studies by the name of Min. He's my surname, Min Jianshu, and he teaches marketing. He's retired now. And quite late in life, he discovered the I Ching, and he's written a wonderful book about the I Ching and business leadership, marketing, you know. It's a great book. And I had lunch with him at the Jockey Club, and we had a real meeting of minds, you know. You know how they say in the I Ching, you should jian da ren, you know. He was really a da ren, you know. He was my elder brother, Min Xiong, I was Min Di, you know. And I found his book fascinating because it's all about business studies. It's all about how the chief executive of an organization should do this, should downsize, should enter a new market, you know. And I asked him if I could quote him. He's very generous. He said, yes, you quote whatever you like. So you'll find in my book, in my translation, almost every single gua I give my own, what I think is the most important aspect. And then I'll mention Professor Mun, because I just call him Professor Mun, M-U-N. And to balance it, you know. But I could also give, a famous doctor wrote a wonderful book about the I Ching and Chinese medicine, you know, and so on and so forth. I mean, but you see, my main focus is the I Ching as a book of self-knowledge, as a book of self-cultivation, you know, something that helps you in what I called on Thursday, and I still call formation, you know, or what the Chinese call 修养, you know, how to become a wiser, better, happier, more fulfilled person, you know. That's my take on the I Ching. It's just mine, you know. That's the one I like. And I use the main commentator that I discovered I really resonated with, you know, who I could hear speaking to me, was a guy from the 18th century by the name of Liu Yiming. And he was a Taoist. He was from the Chen Zhenjiao. And he talked about the I Ching in terms of Nei Dan, you know, alchemy, Taoist Xiuyang, if you like. And he wrote a wonderful commentary on the I Ching, and I use him all the time. I call him Magister Liu, Master Liu. And his commentary is, for me, the most meaningful. But I mean, other people would have a different one, you know. I dare say there'll be one about all kinds of areas of human life. That's what's so extraordinary about this book, is that different people you can put it to different purposes. There's a very fine Buddhist commentary, for example. And I think it's a book for every purpose. That's what's so wonderful about it. And some people say that's because it means nothing, you know. And if something means nothing, you can turn it to any purpose you like. Well, maybe, but I don't think that's true. I think it means nothing in a very special way, you know, because out of nothing comes everything, you know, as the Taoist, as the Tao Te Ching will tell you, you know. You've got Wu and you've got Yo, and I think the I Ching is the absolute ultimate Wu, you know. There's nothing there, you know. You're talking to yourself. You're basically talking to your inner self. And if anything can help you to talk to your inner self, then I think it's a good thing, you know. I think it's a great thing. Anything that can help you to do that. To talk. I mean, in the 1960s, when I was a young man, people were taking LSD and acid because it helped you talk to yourself, you know. I think the I Ching's a lot healthier than that, you know. It's much better than any kind of drug, you know. And especially if you buy my copy, then I get some royalties, right? No, I mean, I can be frivolous too, especially when you ask the question, you know. But that's my answer. Is that any kind of answer to your question, or have I completely failed to understand your question?
At the same time, could you please share with us what is your feeling about the art of war? Because I know you hate it. You hate with an eye made luminous by love of human beings. Could you share this kind of thoughts with the audience?
Well, I think as I've written, I did an interview with the website sonshi.com, which is the big Sunzi Bingfa website. And I did it on condition they printed every word I said. And they did, and it's up there. And I said that the one thing missing from the art of war is love, you know. The one thing missing from the art of war is any sense of altruism, any sense of loving your neighbor. It's just how to take advantage of your neighbor, how to triumph over your neighbor, how to manipulate your neighbor. I'm sorry, we've got Machiavelli, we don't need the art of war, you know. It's a very nasty book. How to use your spies, you know, that chapter 13 on spies is chilling, you know. The whole book, of course it's very clever, and of course a lot of it's very true, and of course we can go through life, you know, treating people in that way if you want to, but I don't happen to believe that's the best way to go, you know. And that's why even Confucius, you know, the Lunyu is a superior book, you know, to Sunzi Bingfa, because the Lunyu talks about morality, it talks about, you know, caring for your fellow human being, you know. After all, the whole idea of Ren, you know, of your feeling towards your human, doesn't come in Sunzi Bingfa at all, you know. Sunzi Bingfa is how to use your friends and neighbors in order to get the better of them, you know. That doesn't make me feel good, you know. I'm an old-fashioned kind of guy, you know, and I believe in being nice to people whenever I can. Sometimes, of course, people are really bad and you have to be nasty to them, or you have to try and ignore them, but you don't go out of your way like Sunzi to sort of manipulate everybody, including your friends. For me, Sunzi Bingfa is the dark side of Chinese culture, you know. It's the dark side, and I know it's there, and there's a dark side to Western culture too, you know, and therefore it's important to be aware of it, but not to be corrupted by it, you know, not to be polluted by it, because it is a very powerfully polluting little book. Very nasty little book. Let's not pretend otherwise, you know. I did it because somebody told me I would earn money by doing it. You know, I'm sorry, I don't feel very good about that, but that was the truth.
No questions? Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Minford, for introducing the love and beauty of Mr. James Legge's work. And I'm sure I'm not alone in feeling humbled, inspired, and grateful for the wonderful lecture this afternoon. Shall we give a big round of applause to Professor Minford, please?